Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. We are gonna get started in about 2 minutes, so just sit tight and we'll be back at 2 minutes. Alrighty. Hey guys, thank you guys all for joining our webinar. My name is Angela and I'm the Director of Marketing at Hull. So as a marketer, there have been definitely times at every company that I've worked at where I felt like the quality of our marketing data was the elephant in the room. Like, we always knew that there was some percentage of our database that was just going to be flat out wrong, whether it was like prospects who no longer worked at the company anymore, or mistagged customers in Salesforce, or like just really obvious bad typos. And like at one company, our data quality problems were just so pervasive that we actually ended up hiring a team of interns to manually comb through our data and like fix things. So hopefully, maybe you're not at that point yet, but I'm sure that if you're here today, some of these bad data implications, clearly resonate. But that being said, I'm really excited for this webinar today because even though some bad data will be inevitable in marketing and in sales, we do know that there are strategies out there that can help mitigate and prevent, a lot of what you might be dealing with today. I also want to preface this by saying that what Brad and Tim are going to share today is like a teeny fraction of their very extensive knowledge about working with data, cleaning data, integrating data. And we definitely don't feel like data management and data cleansing is a one-size-fits-all approach, because we know that every company is different. So if you do really want to dive in and talk about data quality for your specific organization and want some like very directed guidance, we recommend getting in touch with us afterwards and having more of a one-on-one discussion. So yeah, that being said, let's kick this off. So first things first, definitely don't be shy. I see a lot of familiar faces from our last webinar actually, and last time I loved how everyone was just kind of chatting in, engaging with us, engaging with the speakers, with each other. We definitely encourage people to use the chat box to comment and participate, so definitely do that. I'm going to try really hard to get the recording out oh, hello, Tim. To get the recording out within 24 hours. So definitely be on the lookout for that in your inbox, or your spam folders, actually. I hate that I have to say that, but sometimes my emails have been going into spam, so don't forget to check that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to kick it off to Brad and Tim to introduce themselves.
Fantastic. Thanks, Angela. And thanks for having us here. Thanks for putting all this hard work into getting us set up for the webinar. We're excited. Like Angela said, I'm Brad Smith, co-founder and CEO of Sonar. Before we even get into what we do, and even why Tim and I are talking, Angela did neglect to say that her and I used to work together a long time ago, before we both kind of went off into different adventures. So it's great to be working with her again, obviously on this webinar. But for those folks that don't know about Sonar, we're a change management and collaboration platform for operations and Salesforce consultants alike. What does that really mean? Tech stacks are hard. Tim and I are going to jump into that all throughout this entire webinar, but the reality is Sonar makes it much easier for you to go through a lot of the change management and collaboration within your team, managing some of this pesky bad data that we're going to be talking about, as well as other attributes. Alongside of Sonar, we also run a Slack-based community called Wizard of Ops, or WizOps for short. Great place for operations folks, data nerds like us, as well as anyone in the Salesforce ecosystem to really jump in, collaborate, network, and help troubleshoot any issues folks have. But excited to be here, and Tim, I'll pass it off to you.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Tim Liu, head of product from Hull. Hull is a product that synchronizes all your data, bringing it all into one place, and then allowing you to create automation that helps your sales and marketing teams coordinate better. So I'm really excited to be here. It was fun actually preparing this webinar with Brad. You know, there's so many war stories from over the years. I've been in data most of my career, and data quality, I feel like, is one of the least talked about things. I think it's, you know, data quality issues are everywhere, and I feel like when you're stuck in these projects, you feel like you're the only one that has these issues, and everybody else is off doing really cool things with data. Data quality issues are everywhere, and there's a million different ways to solve them. And so I think we'll talk about some of the common issues, and we'll also talk about some of the common things to think about when you're on these projects. So I'm pretty excited to be talking about this with Brad. We had a lot of fun preparing some of the stories and everything.
Absolutely. I believe going to the next thing, we do have a couple of polls that we'll be sharing throughout the day. So obviously the first one, nice little warm-up question is, how's everyone doing today? But hopefully your week is off to a great start. Hopefully it's going to be a busy and productive week, especially as a lot of folks in the U.S. are starting to head into perhaps a holiday week next week. But as we look into the next poll, into the next question, one of the things that, to Tim's point, when we were starting to go through this, is what are some of the biggest obstacles in keeping your data clean? So we just enabled the poll. If you're in the chat or in the webinar, you got that screen pulled up, please pop over to the poll section on the top right corner and answer your first one. How's everyone's day doing? I hope everybody's hitting best week ever, but we'll see. Looks like there's some folks coming in excited for the weekend. I can agree with that as well. So shockingly right now, I can't see where anybody is hitting when it's happy hour. I guess we're the only ones on the East Coast, Tim and Angela, that are thinking more so about the happy hour side of things. But I do love seeing this overall response right now, with most folks saying it's the best week ever. So love hearing that. But really getting into the sort of the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. What is the biggest obstacle keeping you from clean data? A couple of options here. We didn't have a chance to put every single bullet point for why it's tough to keep data clean, but please look through these. We'll give you a little bit of time to answer, but the first one being the lack of visibility on how and where your data is used, lack of connection between systems, near and dear to our heart, siloed ownership for tools. Another big piece that Tim and I both, as we were prepping for this, had a lot of pieces to go back and forth on. Tech debt and human error being both of those. So please make your selection, submit, vote. We'll take a look through some of the results as they're coming in. For those that haven't answered, please answer, because once you see that answer, you get to start seeing what the poll results look like. Almost from a resounding piece of this, Tim, this is going to be fun for the next little bit that we get to talk about it, because a lot of folks are looking at tech debt.
Yeah, tech debt's a really interesting one, because when you first start on a data project, everything's a little bit greenfield. Maybe you've got existing data, but that's where the unknown complexity lies. And especially even after you've kind of set up your production data flows, making changes is something that's just a reality of your life. And, one change in the wrong place sometime cascades. So I think we'll definitely talk about the few strategies to kind of get around that. You certainly don't want to boil the ocean, and things we'll talk about in a minute.
Absolutely. So we'll give it another second or so for the polls to sort of close. But tech debt, legacy data is going to be a big topic for the conversation. Leading the way right now, a split between human error and lack of visibility. I think there's a tie between those, or at least a bridge we can connect between the human error because of the lack of visibility, or perhaps lack of visibility causing human error. Kind of a little bit of back and forth, and we're starting to get some results for siloed ownership of tools. We're going to talk about that almost extensively of this, because in 2020, almost 21, tools are running the world right now. We have a new piece of software for everything. So perfect. We can start moving into the next couple pieces. Thank you again for everyone for jumping into the polls. We'll have a couple more things popping up this way, but really, this is a lot of what we'll cover. And Tim, I'll kind of pass it off to you to kind of walk through all the points.
Yeah, I think we're going to try to keep things tactical and give people some practical advice. I think we'll start by setting the stage with, what do we mean by bad data? Honestly, I've heard people call bad data things where the data is just the data and it was just a misconception of what should be there. But certainly there are, gaps in the data, just typos, for instance. I think we'll quickly kind of define the different types of bad data, go through, the impact that we've seen of bad data. It sounds like probably our crowd here knows the impact in many cases. So I think we'll probably spend most of our time, in the talking about the different ways to prevent and clean and mitigate strategies, mitigation strategies around getting past it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about what bad data scenarios have we faced, I think we talked a little bit about this in some of the poll pieces of it, but the big things that we're really going to try to cover and where we really try to focus our time is on incomplete data, duplicate records, typos, legacy fields that haven't been cleaned up. We have a ton of those conversations with our customers all the time about this, along with other examples. But first, before we even try to go through most of those examples, what do we truly mean by bad data? So when we get to the next slide, this is where these are some of the most common examples of bad data. We like to think of it, especially on the Sonar side, when we start to hear about bad data. And again, because as a level set, what we do is help customers understand how their technology is flowing data between systems, as well as any sort of automations that are underlying that could be controlling their data. So you see things, we talk to folks all the time about merging records and merging fields. From a metadata standpoint, we need to understand really how this piping and plumbing starts to work. Legacy fields, too often when we talk to a lot of our customers, most of the time they didn't have the luxury of turning Salesforce on or any CRM on for the first time. Truthfully, in my career, until I started my own company, was the only time I ever got to be the first person in Salesforce to start creating fields and creating automations. Prior to that, we're always inheriting that. And so you're always going to have legacy fields. Tim, I know you've looked at some of this.
Yeah, I think, right. I think there's a lot of issues that we're pretty used to dealing with, like, unstandardized data, things like, certainly duplicate data records, and I'll talk quite a bit about that. And then fields in different places that you have to unify. Those are all issues that we see quite a bit that we can help people find strategies around. Some of the harder things that we face are when data flows go wrong. Hull is a data synchronization tool, so there's a lot of data flying around in real time, and when some of those data flows go wrong, I think it's really valuable to have that transparency, but it's still kind of difficult to reason about how this data flies around. And then I think one of the harder topics, and I'll provide maybe a little bit of context on how you can fix it, but one of the harder topics are merging records. We have a lot of questions about that. Typically, stopping it from happening in the first place is always the best strategy, but these are some pretty hard topics, and so I don't want anybody to feel like they're the only people who are having these issues. We see them across industry.
Absolutely. And as we start to transition to what do we mean more by bad data to what are some of the downstream impacts, quick reminder, jump over to the polls. We did just drop another one in about what bad data scenarios have you faced. And as you're filling that out, please go fill your pieces out, and we'll tell you more about some of the results from that poll. But when we think about the downstream impact of this, this is where we actually start to feel some of the what we call the people pain of this. We talk about systems, we talk about spreadsheets, we talk about how we orchestrate all this data, but when we think about the impact it causes pain to us, the person that is actually using this data to make business decisions. So you can see a couple of the big downstream impacts: inaccurate and suboptimal targeting, missed sales opportunities. When we talk about people impact, think about the sales folks, the customer success folks, the marketing teams. If they don't have the right data, man, they're struggling to execute their tasks and to do exactly what they're hired for. I think more than anything, inaccurate performance reporting. I think we've all been in that dreaded boardroom scenario where you're looking through some of your data with your executives. And I always tell folks that dreaded boardroom story of, we all gather around the table and let's start at the top of the funnel. Marketing gets to kick off, and marketing says, last quarter was fantastic. We generated 5 million in new opportunities for our sales team. We hit our number. It was great. They pass it on to the sales rep or the sales leader, and they're like kind of, a little eyebrow raised down the table. I didn't see 5 million come through. We saw 4 million in new opportunities come through, but that's okay because we closed 3 million of it. Great conversion rates. We had a successful quarter. We're close to our number, but not all the way. And, you kind of keep going around the table and pass it over to the success person, and your customer success is like, I didn't see you close 3 million. I saw you close 2. That's okay because we had 90% retention. And by the end of this story, you just look down at your CFO or your CEO, and they just have their hands in their face because nobody has their data right. And I think that's one of the biggest impacts that we all see as far as just the true implications of bad data. It's harder to make business decisions out of it.
Right.
Go ahead, Tim.
No, I was about to say, my life is spent in these edge case scenarios. I mean, these can be really tough situations. Certainly, when you miss out on sales opportunities, but even just the day to day that kind of wears on you. Just another field that got overwritten. Can't quite feel like I'm confident in changing my production workflow.
Yeah. Absolutely. As a quick, as we transition in sort of part of the next talk track, it is fun looking at the poll results. Pretty spread out, to be honest. We have a lot of folks battling with duplicate records, a lot of incomplete data. To no surprise, legacy fields is always going to be a big one, and we're all still humans. Typos still happen, and so it's interesting to see some of the scenarios that you're facing. So.
Yeah, based off of my experience from the last week, I think I would vote with duplicate records.
Yeah,
definitely seen a few Salesforce instances with duplicate records in there.
You're spot on. Incomplete data is always going to be one of those near and dear to my heart. We see a lot of automation that helps keep people in guardrails for incomplete data, but I think there's still always going to be a piece of it.
Yeah, so I think we just talked a little bit about all the specific things that can happen, in your day-to-day life. But even at the highest level, people are recognizing more and more that, the problem with bad data is that you're actually wasting money, whether it's, your retargeting budgets or your prospecting budgets. Forrester says that 21% of your marketing budget is wasted on bad data, especially as we get to more automated scenarios with personalization, with outreach. It really makes sense to figure out how to, make sure that you're using good data. I think the rise of sort of the revenue ops role and the data ops role in general, I think as a trend is sort of evidence of this, that people, it's not just the operators of this, it's not just the sales team and the marketing team anymore. It's somebody sitting there in the middle trying to coordinate all this. And the only way that they could do it is with good data.
Yeah, you're spot on. I think there's probably 2 personas, or at least 2 point of views right now that everybody on this call is looking at that number on. And it's, I'd probably say from the executive side, that like 21% of the budget that I've allocated to that marketing team is going to waste. And then the other part of that room is like, man, if I had 20% more of budget, or if I could reallocate 20% of my budget, what would I go buy? What would I go invest in? And I think it's almost a zero-sum game when you think about it, because at the end of the day, there's still 21% of marketing budgets that are not going to be used successfully. And that's tough when you think of a fifth of your budget that's going to be impacted by that, just by the sheer quality or part of bad data. So one more as we go into the next poll. When bad data strikes, what do you feel is the biggest misalignment? And again, we talked tactical for a second about the systems, or if we're looking at just even the incomplete data and the duplicate records, which is all very, very tangible. I think some of this now becomes a little personal to some folks because it has more to do with people and the process and how we're doing it. So please submit your vote for when this occurs. What do you feel the biggest misalignment is? We'll start to see, to no surprise, on a lot of the results, all of the above is coming in. I'm going to have to agree there. I didn't want to, give anybody bias here, but yeah, I mean, I've got multiple stories for all of those. Yeah, I think it's true. I think when we look at the way that gets answered, and overwhelmingly 75% of everybody saying all the above, you start to think of the dependencies on all these. You can't have a process without people. You can't help me understand which process isn't driven by tech. We're not all, to a caveman perspective where we're putting all this, writing it down on a piece of paper anymore. So tech is enabling us to do it, but also it can be a hindrance as well. So interesting to see, but overwhelmingly I would agree. All the above. You can't have one without the other.
Well, if you think about it, maybe does all just originate with people. So I like the people who are voting just for people.
Yep, I can agree with that. We're not all robots yet. That's for sure. So we'll spend a little bit of time here. When we think of when bad data strikes, there's a couple of different scenarios that we start to think about. Anytime you're internally merging or expanding departments, executing too quickly, onboarding new tech, and honestly, just status quo isn't working anymore. When one of the best examples that I think about this is in a previous role with a previous company, going through any sort of merger, any sort of M&A event, and whether that could be internal, if it's my company that's going to acquire another one, or vice versa. Or even merging of departments. We see a lot of this now on sales and marketing alignment. How do we? A lot of this now rolls under a CRO in some instances. And so the example I think about most often was an actual acquisition a company of mine went through previously, and I'm sitting here looking at myself in the mirror. I'm at the time a one-person operations shop, and I've got an entire tech stack over here that was very complex. Salesforce, Marketo, SalesLoft, ZoomInfo. And we just acquired this other tech stack, which was great. It was Salesforce at least. We had a common denominator. But then you go into Pardot, and then you go into Outreach, and then you go into LeadIQ. And, there's business decisions to be made there. Which one of these systems do we go with? Not exactly the root of what our webinar will be about today. But when you think about the data quality behind all this, how do you start to identify which system of record is going to be used moving forward? Which of these systems, right now, before we can jump into all the quality side, finger in the wind, which one has better data quality? Which one are we going to start to use and start to move some data back and forth? Tim, I know you practice this almost extensively with a lot of the CDP side of Hull, but it's a big piece how it's happening.
I mean, a lot of our customers, are trying to grow rapidly, which is why they bring on a CDP. So, these are times at which, you're wanting to automate more. You're starting to look at your data more, and you're realizing that, maybe this data wasn't as good as you thought it was, or maybe these processes aren't as good as you thought they were.
Yeah, and when I really think about, especially the onboarding new tech. Doing this for as long as I have, I realize that we all don't live in a vacuum, and we don't live with a static tech stack. We are constantly, for better or for worse, not to say that it's best practice or not, but we're constantly moving data in and out. And we're saying, this is our system of record, and we use that for a year. We're coming up for renewal. Maybe we try a new system, or maybe we weren't happy with the previous one and now we're going somewhere else. Those have big implications for bad data quality. And if you don't understand which of these systems is driving what, and this is what a lot of the Sonar platform does, is help you understand this, blueprint for what your tech stack looks like. And the minute that the analogy we use often, which resonates with a lot of folks, would you ever think about making a big home renovation without seeing the blueprint of your house first? How do you know what's behind that wall? And if you're going to expand that or condense it or make a change to it, if you don't know the wires or the studs or anything else that's behind there, you're going to make a pretty big and drastic mistake. And so, again, we always are going to preach, people, processes, and tech. Make sure that these are all aligned when you're making some of these decisions. Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet that Tim or I could prescribe to say, go use this exact methodology. But if you don't have the focus on those, you're going to start to find yourself kind of in a tough spot.
All right. I was actually just going to use that phrase, we don't have a silver bullet, but we have a bunch of strategies. And I hope, none of this is too fluffy for you guys. We're going to try to get into like some real ways you can mitigate bad data. So, firstly, beginning with the end in mind, don't want to boil the ocean. There's bad data everywhere. You're not going to solve all of your company's bad data problems, but figuring out where you want to get to and the value you want to drive, I think from the very beginning is really important. And then the first step is always gaining visibility, figuring out where the bad data may lie, and then architecting and executing upon a plan to clean it up and get to the value you want to get to. And then, the fourth, more understated, point here is, you want to make sure that you maintain that flow that you've set up and that you've set yourself up for success so that you can make changes and do tests and, upgrade it in the future as well.
Absolutely. The one thing, and we don't want to sound, too cliche here, but you hear this often, begin with the end in mind. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think it's habit number 2, if I'm not mistaken. But it resonates here when you start to think of the projects that we're working on. What are we actually trying to solve for these? Because if we don't have a clear line of sight with what our end goal is, and again, Tim mentioned this, we're going to move into how do we measure the success of this. But if we don't even know what goal we're striving towards, it can be tough. We'll see this here in a second about planning and planning ahead and plan ahead to mitigate risk. But more than anything, when you think about beginning with the end in mind and you're really starting to set that goal up, make sure that it does 2 things. Make sure that you have hopefully revenue alignment to that. Now, I know not everything is sales and marketing, customer success. We've got folks in finance on here. We've got support. We've got operations. But I think you could always boil down some of your changes in the way that you're going to go about attacking some of these data issues with beginning with how, what's our goal at the end? What revenue is it going to drive? And I think, more importantly is put some pretty tight guardrails around that. Tim mentioned this, don't try to boil the ocean. Too often when we go through a lot of these projects, scope creep's almost inevitable. We're always going to find something, hiding behind a rock that we didn't account for, and so we have to adjust for it. Absolutely, but when we really start to deviate in projects is really when we start to have really bad scope creep. Deliverables aren't happening on time, and we're almost adding more complexity than we need to. I think a common example that I've experienced even prior to running operations for a few different companies was doing consulting work myself. And you want your customer to come and say, you're doing a great job. I have one more thing. Let's think about how we attack this. And that's great. You want to hear and be very conscious of that, but you have to be very vocal and say, that's not, that's adjusting what our end goal looks like. Let's make sure that we can either bake that in, here's some of the consequences that go into that, or let's stay on track with this project and perhaps queue that up for the next one. But data projects happen all the time. You think that and Tim, you can see a lot of this too. You build a project, you say, these are the 10 fields that I want to really focus on. And then field number 11 comes in and like, oh, but we forgot about field 12. And then by that point, you're boiling 30 fields.
Yeah, in my previous life, I was a developer, and I think developers are notoriously are known for, bad estimates, and I think it's not necessarily all their fault, and it's not necessarily all my fault when I was a developer for making bad estimates. You estimate based off of what you've done in the past. But in going forward on the new thing, if you haven't done something, you just don't know, and you kind of hope for the best that it's kind of like the same. And I think it's even more so in data. You have a small data set in front of you. You look at the points that are there. You say, yeah, it kind of makes sense to take that data and put it over there. But doing it in production at scale, there is always unknown complexity. There is always the API that doesn't quite behave as you thought it was going to be. There's always the data point that that comes in that you didn't think was going to come in. So when I'm scoping projects up front, I don't actually give an estimate or a scope until I've seen the data a little bit more, because depending on the condition of the data, it could the project scope could vary vastly. So I think one way or another, when you're going into a data project, especially where cleanliness may be an issue, really try to get those risks, get some eyes on those risks up front. A lot of the time you kind of want to say, yeah, that'll be, a problem for me next week. And nobody wants to be in that position where you're almost at the end and then you discover all these issues. I think tackling the bad data and the possible risks head on, that's the only way to kind of gain a little bit of consistency and trackability on your project.
Yeah, you're spot on. I think it's funny when I look at this image and a little backstory of this image. Can't tell you how old it is. It's almost as old as Sonar, I think, at this point, because it's one of the first ones we started to use to understand how complex this looks like. And when we talk about planning ahead, if you have one project that's really specific to one or two things, you can see how quickly it turns into 4 and 5 and 6, because all these systems and all the data is connected in some way or the other. But again, keep those guardrails in place. And Tim, I know you're about to start talking about gaining visibility into those systems, but really, begin with the end in mind and definitely mitigate that risk appropriately.
Yeah. So like I was saying, before you can scope a project, you really need to know what you're dealing with. So seeing the data, not just a small sample set, seeing a much larger sample set is really important. So the first thing I always recommend is bring all your data into the same place. And that's sort of what CDPs are designed to do as step one. The goal of a CDP is, I think, is much loftier probably. But the first step is always bringing your data together and unifying it to make sure that you have the full picture. Where do titles exist and where do they not exist? Where are there multiple titles? Where are there multiple data points that are different? That's just to start. And then certainly I think duplicate data is always sort of an issue where if you've got 5 versions of a person in one system and 1 version of a person in another system, that's always going to be kind of an issue. I'm going to talk about how you can get around or fix that in a little bit, but just kind of bringing it all into one place so that you can see what is actually the state of the world is the obvious first step. And then figuring out where the best data is. Where do they maintain the data? Maybe it's not in Salesforce. Maybe it's not in Marketo. Maybe it's actually a spreadsheet somewhere where the CEO told some guy, you better make sure this spreadsheet is up to date no matter what, because I know Salesforce isn't the source of truth anymore. Figuring out where that best data is and then beginning to kind of synchronize it all together so you could propagate that best data out, I think is a good first step.
Absolutely. And, when we think about, we preface this at the very beginning, but we'll kind of double down on it here. When we talk about data quality, it's, you can't really have data without metadata, especially in the technologies that we're using these days to push all this data from one system to another, to a spreadsheet, back to another. We go back to this recommendation of a blueprint again, because if you don't understand how these systems are tied together and you don't have it documented properly, it's almost a moot point, because you don't really understand where the quality of your data is residing, or where it's coming from, that source of truth. A couple of quick little screens here, and we illustrate this a lot with a lot of our customers. Understand how it's being mapped. And that sounds goofy, but one of the first things that drove us to creating Sonar and helping to solve a lot of this problem is just understanding where this one field is being used, whether it be in a different system, a different business process, a report. These are important things. And if you don't understand how they're being used and where they're being used, you're really not going to be able to take that next step, which is going to be starting to architect how we make this data even better. But a lot of the times it's just understanding which systems are using what, and more importantly, who owns those. We don't, keep me honest here, Tim, we don't live in a vacuum anymore where there's probably one person that owns technology these days. Multiple folks own it. You think of marketing automation platforms, CDP platforms. Marketing has a big piece to that. There's a lot of sales systems, Salesforce being almost the common denominator for a lot of these, but your sales engagement systems, Outreach and SalesLoft and Groove and all of your different data providers. I don't have enough fingers and toes to count all those, but again, if you don't know who owns these systems and in what capacity they own them, if they own them just from a configuration standpoint, or if they own them from a reporting standpoint or the integration perspective, it can be really challenging to solve for the quality side. And I think you find yourself on a little bit of a hamster wheel of sorts.
Yeah. Well, now I think we're getting to kind of the fun part where we talk about how do you kind of design your plan and execute on it. And the first step that I keep on saying the first step, but well, this is like the third step now. So, once you have your data all in one place and you have some visibility on it, I think the thing that I always talk about then is your identity resolution strategy. So I think from a high level, it's, talking about what entities are you really moving around? What are the core entities in sales and marketing? A lot of the time it's accounts and users. And how do you identify those accounts and users between systems? Because that's really sort of the heart of duplication in many cases, I would argue, where, in one system, your email marketing system, it's email for sure. In another system, it may just be first name, last name, maybe a LinkedIn handle. Maybe you've got some automated lead gen that's going out and grabbing LinkedIn handles from LinkedIn. So I think, what I'll talk a little bit about here is, say for a user, for example, email is a pretty good one. The edge cases there are always, well, what if a person switches jobs? Well, what if they get a new email? And those are hard cases. I would, when you think about identity resolution and specifically for users, I would this is one of those opportunities to say, maybe I don't need to solve the problem where they're switching jobs, or maybe they have a slightly different email. And there are strategies for doing that, no doubt. But maybe in this project, we'll keep the scope around email. And so I think in many projects that I've rolled out for customers, we start, if the data is fairly messy, we start by unifying everything around email. Let's just make sure email is unique. We don't have to make sure everything is unique. Let's at least make sure that email is, and then you could start to do some marketing campaigns with that and make sure that you're not duplicating between systems. Then you can start, and maybe that person isn't at that email anymore. It'll bounce, fine. We're not going to use that again. But then you can at least start to synchronize the data between your systems. And then, as you kind of, move on to your next project, maybe you can bring in more advanced logic. Certain companies can really make use of what we call an external ID or a universal ID. These are the types of companies where the top of their funnel is sort of a freemium model where they're bringing in leads into their free trial, and then from those free trials, you're trying to convert into a paid subscription. And so the way that external ID works is when a person signs up for your system, they create an account with you, and they are assigned an ID in your system, and that ID is great for tracking them, all the way down the funnel. If they do go in and change their email on their profile, you still have that ID that's the same throughout the entire process. And then you can propagate those email changes if you want. So anytime you do kind of have a top of the funnel that has sort of a free trial and you can use that external ID, that's a pretty powerful concept. So where it gets a little bit more hairy is when you don't have, you have some use case where you need to be able to have a little bit of fuzzy logic around your email and you don't have an external ID. So maybe you need multiple natural keys. And that's I think those are the ones that are the toughest. Certainly you can get into fuzzy matching. I've been mostly using the user example. Accounts, for example, are, much more fuzzy because, what defines an account? Is it the domain? Yeah, it could be. Is it the DUNS number? Yeah, it could be. Is it the region of the account? Is it the parent of the account? Is it the parent's parent? So I think depending on your situation, you really have to look at, what makes sense for you. And certainly and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but certainly with accounts, there's a level at which you kind of want to verify this stuff, because whether you're getting your data from Clearbit or whether it's, some sort of, LinkedIn lead gen, if you're going to be doing account-based marketing, I think and you're not looking at, hundreds of thousands of accounts, I think it might be worth kind of thinking about, how somebody maybe from your sales team can go and make sure that that account is correct. These people are for that account, and maybe it's generated for him to start. But as the prospect becomes more and more serious, you probably want somebody to go in and make sure, especially for account creation where there's so many different strategies. Right. So that once you've kind of gotten through, what makes sense for you as an identity strategy for these individual entities, I think one thing I'd like to touch on is the relationship between the entities, which, I alluded to previously briefly. This can be a pretty hard problem where you may have to make some trade-offs where, what do you need this data for? So for example, the relationship between a contact and an account. And I kind of like how Salesforce has a process where, and many CRMs have a process where you can take a lead and then there's sort of a manual gate where the process to convert a lead to a contact. And when that happens, the salesperson actually makes sure to, create the account. I think in many cases, the CRM is the source of truth for much of these relationships, but that's not always ideal. You kind of want to ship this data as best you can to the salespeople in the best configuration possible based off of what you know. So like I was saying before, in sort of a freemium trial model, that's nice because, certain guy signed up, he invited a bunch of his friends. They're probably all the same account and opportunity because there's a credit card there. That's the thing that you can create in Salesforce. Not everybody has that. So, maybe it's up to you to kind of make sure that you will, like, all the domains match, or maybe you've revealed using Clearbit that these guys are all the same parent company. And I think, depending on the situation, you create as best you can, and then you push to a place where it can be confirmed, your source of truth. And then your salespeople, as they begin to reach out with more personal touches, you can provide them with a way to kind of surface all of this data and potentially correct it or make sure it's in the right format as they begin more personalized outreach.
Yeah. This is one of those ones, Tim, that I take personally. I think we've all felt the pain of it before when the data model is not correct and we don't understand, either the source of truth, but more than anything, when the data is either stale or it's not getting updated properly, whether it be by a person or by automations. What are some of those downstream impacts? We send emails to the wrong cohort of customers. That is one of the ones I'd imagine for anybody in the marketing world right now that's on this call that has found themselves with that egg on their face at some point of like, oh, I forgot that automated email was going out based on this criteria and we didn't have our data model set up correct so that it didn't prohibit that email from going out. We've all walked it back. I've been there many a time, unfortunately. But it's something we're always striving to get better on. But I think it all, to your point, starts with the data model itself.
All right. So Angela just reminded me that we only have 15 minutes left, so maybe I'll move a little bit quicker. Honestly, you buy me a beer, I'll talk about data quality all day. So once you kind of get your model and your relationships figured out figured out, then the real work begins, right? You got to start standardizing your field so that you can use it in a templated email. You got to start, making sure that you've got the countries in a standard format. You have to potentially compute attributes that you can use later to push these users based off of certain behavior. One of the features that our customers really like about Hull is that we give you a lot of flexibility to kind of standardize, clean, and really manipulate this data however you want on the fly.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that we always look at is promote consistency. Push this data model, push a lot of these cleaning exercises over to your enablement team. I think more than anything, we always have to remember we don't live in a static vacuum. What we're working on yesterday and this week is probably going to change the next week. So how do we get more consistent with the changes we're making? I think a lot of it boils down to documentation. Please, for the current folks that are running systems and the Salesforce admins, even if that's not your title, it could be your second title or third title or just one of the responsibilities you have. But document this information and understand how all these different systems are using these different pieces of data. And you can even see here in a couple of our shots that things are constantly changing. You're constantly bringing in new fields, new automations. If you don't have a level set naming convention and documentation pattern, it's really going to cause you more of a headache than anything else when you go to make that one, quote, small change that has a big ripple effect on your data quality, your automations that drive a lot of the data that you're trying to keep in line and spending, again, a lot of money in doing so. So promote consistency within your org. We really can't say it enough because the more consistent you are with the data side of it and the documentation side, the better off you're going to be.
So like I was saying before, my life is spent in the data edge cases and, debugging crazy data flows end to end. The more automation that you put in place, the more good automation that you put in place even, the more it's going to get a little bit more complicated. So just a couple pieces of advice, when you're running large scale, this is advice from experience. When you're running large-scale cleaning operations, if you can, create a backup. Any way to undo is your friend. I promise you that comes from experience. And especially when you're cleaning fields, you're merging duplicates, you're doing all these things to make your data better. Any kind of way to potentially undo is just makes me feel a little safer. And then one sort of piece of advice that I feel like comes from having done things the wrong way before. As an engineer and probably as an operations person, you want to automate as much as possible. Really your job is to automate all the way if you can. The problem with thinking that is that something will always come up that defeats the automation. And if you planned at the beginning and implemented it in a way that you can't intervene and that no one can intervene, it makes life much more difficult because then, you've got to get your engineer or you've got to go back in and figure out things when, a salesperson, maybe you didn't get the automation exactly right. Maybe the salesperson can just, flip the switch on their side, make sure that they do the manual correction, and then you can move on. So always having a way to kind of manually correct if possible is a nice way to at least, enable your sales team or enable yourself so that you don't have to debug every possible thing that could go wrong.
Yeah, you're spot on with that, Tim. I think when we think about this fourth pillar, and again, we've only got a slide or two left, and we'd love to see some questions come up from the audience. So feel free to pop over to the question side or the chat side and pop those in. But again, this fourth pillar that we're always going to be looking at and focusing heavily on is measure and maintain. We don't start these projects to do them once and to get to a perfect static state and stay there forever. We're constantly going to be evolving. We're constantly going to be looking through how we can do this better. How can we make these changes more effective, more efficient? So when you think about some of these ways that we really want to measure it, excuse me, again, we're gonna keep pounding our hands on the table and say, but begin with the end in mind, and don't lose sight of what you're truly trying to accomplish, either in this one project or for this 1 year. A lot of us are going into 21 planning right now and understanding what goals we want to achieve. It's goofy. Write them down. Write them down to keep each other honest on every project check-in. Be sure to say, are we accomplishing exactly what we set out to do, or have we deviated? Those goals drive revenue. Hopefully your leadership teams are holding those goals and those projects that you're setting accountable to the revenue that should be bringing the company in some form or fashion. And I think, define what success looks like. I hope nobody's just doing a project to do a project, but you never know. That happens at times. And so, define what success looks like and pay attention to how those, even the small steps you're taking, make big waves into how it's driving revenue and continued success for your company. This is a hot topic that, Tim, to your point, if somebody wanted to buy you a beer on data, you could buy me a beer on vanity metrics.
All right. Sounds good.
I think I've done a few other webinars or chats on vanity metrics, but just be mindful about setting those aside during these specific data quality projects. If you're going to be cleaning data, and if you're going to be making sure that it's flowing between the right places, be sure that it's a data point that you're excited about and is meaningful to your company. Man, I've seen, even back in the consulting days, I've seen so many people go through projects to track a metric that you go to ask them at the end of that 3, 6, 9 month project, what are you going to use that metric for? They're like, well, somebody asked me about it a long time ago, so I just wanted to have it. Like, are you going to make a business decision out of it? If not, do you really want to spend your time on it? And so just, again, always being mindful of that. And of course, know what data points you need to be collecting to keep the momentum and the progress towards your goal. There's always going to be a curveball. Things are always going to pop up. There's always going to be a deviation, but the better that you can constantly remind yourself of measuring what's successful for you is just extremely important.
So just to, I think Stuart just asked a question about machine learning. I've been in data for a long time. I am always skeptical of machine learning. I've been watching, especially the data quality space, pan out over the last 5 to 10 years. I think there was some pretty, they call it data wrangling now. I think there was some pretty, interesting companies that were started 5 to 10 years ago. Pixata, I think Trifecta does this too. I think I saw Arpit on the call. I think we want to believe that a machine can clean up all of our data and make right all of the sins of the past. I've never seen it in practice. What I have seen in practice is if you've got a bad data set, location is a really good example. If you've got a bunch of addresses that you're not really sure if they're right or wrong, yes, geolocating, doing some, parsing is going to get you so far, but then you want to clean that whole data set, you're going to be on Google Streets for a while, making sure that those addresses exist. So I want to believe that machine learning can help. There are some data scrubbing tools, I think, out there that make things a lot easier, things where you can do batch updates, things where you potentially can undo. There's not a lot of them, though. And I think as far as machine learning goes, I think my instinct is that it will always be kind of human-directed machine learning.
Yeah, you're spot on. I'm in the same camp as you, Tim, on machine learning and AI. It has come a long way, and I think it's still going to continue to go a long way. If anything, I think it goes back to the data model piece that we were talking about earlier. If you have your data aligned the right way, you're going to be in a really good shape to make sure some of these machine learning and AI type systems can be helpful to you. But if you don't have that, it's going to start taking data points here and there that may or may not be important to you the right way, or may not drive your business. And it can almost do some harm, almost just as much harm than good, if you don't have your data aligned the right way.
All right. And I think I really like this slide to end on, because I think it talks about speaks to the future of where data is going in general. So I think a lot of companies come out and say, implement us, we're greenfield, and then you will be successful for the rest of your career. I think, and I think it's important to have a project-based focus to get to a point where you drive value, but then afterwards, sort of that production life cycle of that data and changing things in the future is one of the most painful things after you've got a production data flow going on. So I think it's important to kind of add in ways that you can be notified and alerted if something bad is going wrong. If you have a process where you can route data that isn't 100% good to a manual process, I've seen that work really well. And then certainly, everything that you do, having a commit message in that audit trails. I think when I think about it, when I think about data now, I think about software development maybe 20 years ago, where you start out by adding unit tests. Automated testing was a really big deal. And then they realize, oh, maybe you might have different versions of this. Then you add in version control. And then CI/CD came in with your continuous automated tests and your continuous deployment. And so all these things, all these tools to build out a really good developer experience over the last 20 years, I see kind of data taking that same path where, you want a staging environment. You want unit tests around your data. You want to be able to regression test it. You want to be able to commit it. You want to maybe even have different versions of it or versions of your code with it. So I think that to me is kind of the future of where data is going. And then certainly, having the key stakeholders and project owners around this data and generating the right documentation to make sure that if there is a transition, that can be a smooth transition is always important.
Absolutely. I think more than anything, again, the only constant is change at this point. Communicate. Again, when you look at these alerts and notifications, audit trails, these are all things that you can use technology to do. You can do them internally. Our systems, both Hull and Sonar, help provide a lot of this information. But if you're not keeping your eye on the ball, then you're going to have a hard time, managing that changing landscape. So, certainly want to make sure that we look at these things as they're always over and evolving. So, I know we have a few minutes left. I think we've got roughly about 3 minutes left. We'd love to turn it over to continue Q&A, whether it be in the chat or in the questions section. It looks like Bryce just helped out a little bit with this with Delphia as well. So thank you for that. But yeah, as always, any questions? Tim and I are going to hang out for a second. You can either ask us questions or hear us banter back and forth for a few more minutes. But would love to hear any of y'all's thoughts on the data quality side of things that we've discussed today.
Yeah, Bryce, I think ML is at a pretty interesting stage. I am no expert, but from an outsider's point of view, people are bringing in new ML-based software to create projects that, obviously try to predict something. I think that's where we are. I think where we need to get to is the point where you can deploy something really easily and then redeploy it and change it in a consistent, reliable way. I think a lot of my friends who are deploying ML models, they just say, yeah, we kind of have a couple tests, but we hope the new model's better. And it's really that tooling around figuring out how do you deploy and make sure that the new thing that you're about to deploy is better than the old thing. So it has to do with the tests, sandboxes. Ultimately, I think production data almost needs to flow anywhere to do viable testing. So I think it's a long conversation that I'm pretty interested in. I think it's where the data industry is going.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's same thing that you were just talking about, and even we were talking about on our previous slide about sandboxing, making sure that you're testing these things constantly. Don't live in a vacuum. It sounds goofy to say, but we're always constantly changing these things. And the more folks that we have on top of this, the better. Yeah, completely agree with that last comment, Bryce, about hard to apply a good ML without having good data quality first. Common denominator for sure.
I was talking with my a friend the other day who's in an IoT company, and I always imagined in an IoT company your data is always perfect because it's generated by a machine. And so I'm always jealous of them. But then I was talking with him. He's like, yeah, they can come with gaps, sometimes, duplicates for sure. And so you're constantly, cleaning the data as well, even though it was generated by a machine.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think sometimes the blind spot on that can be the quantity that starts to occur, because if it gets turned loose a little bit, you're like, okay, we just woke up the next day with hundreds of records or thousands of records that now we have to go and clean. So it's wanting to make sure that you keep that a little gated to a certain degree. I know we're right at the top of time. Again, we want to thank everyone. First and foremost, Angela, the whole marketing team, the Sonar marketing team for putting a lot of this on. Easy part was for Tim and I just to get up here and talk about data quality and talk about stuff that we're passionate about and that we do every day. But big thank you to both of our marketing teams for all the hard work of getting this put on. And please don't be a stranger. Here's some of our contact information. Please visit the whole website. Reach out to Angela and Tim to learn more about Whole. If you want to learn more about Sonar, obviously please reach out to me. Would happy to talk with anybody here wanting to learn more. And of course, we have a community that we're all part of, Wizards of Ops or wizops.org. Great job, or great place for y'all to join like-minded folks and troubleshoot, collaborate, communicate about all the fun of data quality. But we appreciate everyone's time and hope you all have a fantastic afternoon, and talk to you soon.